in the US, according to Deal Room, new companies generated $44,000 per capita between the year 2000 and the year 2023 versus 3,300 USD in Europe. So that's a 13 and a half times higher value creation figure versus US companies had access to only 7.5 times more growth capital. So that's a little bit complicated, but the bottom line is that it should be more proportional, right? So you're still seeing the value creation gap much higher than the growth capital gaps.
Welcome to European Tech Talks, a podcast brought to you by the European Champions Alliance. The ECA's mission is simple: support the growth and success of European tech companies in the global market. On this podcast, top tech experts and entrepreneurs from all over Europe will share their insights and actionable tips on how to thrive in the European tech scene and beyond. You'll also get the latest updates on the global tech industry and understand how they impact Europe. 3 dynamic European women host your podcast. Andrea, the founder and soul of the ECA, hosting from Paris, France. Lucie, our marketing and communication junkie, hosting from Karlsruhe, Germany. And myself, Anne-Sophie, the tech and product aficionada, hosting from the Silicon Valley. Join us on this journey as we explore the vibrant European tech ecosystem. You can also connect with our thriving community by becoming a member, by following the ECA on LinkedIn, or simply by subscribing to our newsletter on our website. And now, let's jump right into today's episode.
Welcome to a new episode of ECA Tech Talks, the podcast of the European Champions Alliance, where we talk to entrepreneurs and experts from the European tech ecosystem about scaling in Europe and creating European champions. And today I'm very happy to welcome Cody Barrow. So welcome to the ECA Tech Talks podcast, Cody.
Well, thank you, Andrea. Happy to be here.
So before we dive into our questions about scaling companies in Europe and, talking about the things we have prepared, could you just please present yourself and what you're doing at Eclectic IQ in a couple of minutes?
Absolutely, yes. So I am an American abroad. So I live here in the south of the Netherlands in Breda for the last few years, but I am a career intelligence person. So for a little bit over the last 20 years, I have had, I guess you could say, three professional histories or lives. The first was in the U.S. federal government, where I was an intelligence officer, primarily in Washington, D.C., focused on national level intelligence operations planning, special operations support, and I was a founding member of United States Cyber Command at the National Security Agency. So in my federal life, I mostly split my time between the Pentagon and the National Security Agency, with a short stint in Afghanistan, and really was at the national level in that, I would say, heavily bureaucratic world. So quite relatable coming to Europe in that regard, have to say. And then my other professional lives in the private sector, I led threat intelligence, cyber threat intelligence for Fannie Mae. So there I safeguarded at that time $3.5 trillion in assets, mostly mortgage-backed securities. Now I think it's up to $4.5 trillion, somewhere around there. So we were a very heavily targeted organization by cyber threat actors. And then my third and so far latest life was I've been a building platforms that sell to organizations like Fannie Mae. And here I am the CEO of Eclectic IQ here in the Netherlands. We are Amsterdam headquartered, and we are a global cybersecurity company focused on threat intelligence and really the cyber defense aspect of the cybersecurity world.
So thank you very much, Cody. So we've met at as I said, at the ECA Deep Tech Summit in Amsterdam. And of course, as always for the European Champions Alliance, the questions that we ask, and this was in a specific context on cybersecurity and also quantum, is why are companies in Europe not scaling enough, quick enough? And how can we, let's say, build an ecosystem that helps companies to scale faster, knowing that already the European market is quite big, but then companies have to be strong enough and let's say not necessarily be big enough, but strong enough to go to the market in the US, where there's a big potential, of course. And so I thought it was really interesting to invite you because you have the two visions, the vision of the two markets, the US market where you have spent a lot of your career, and now for several years you're in Europe and you see how things are happening here. So maybe to open up the discussion, we could just, talk about the very easy questions. Why are companies not scaling quick enough in Europe? From your point of view, what are the maybe couple of points that we can start with?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that we need to first level set and emphasize that there is a real challenge, right? And as I usually say, as an American here, I've been here, I think, 5 years now. I still view myself as a hopefully honored guest. Maybe after 15, 20 years, I'll say that I'll say something else. But I try not to criticize my hosts, right? But I think that as a business leader here and having interacted with a lot of other European CEOs, investors, and politicians over the last few years, I think that it's very nice to see that everyone seems to see the same challenge, which is that it's not just a shortage of European growth capital, which is there versus the US. It's also a shortage of European value creations. There are numerous vehicles out there, numerous funds working to try to reduce the growth capital gaps. So, for example, there's the European Investment Bank, which is a great venture debt tool for helping European startups scale. Several funds, including one of our investors, 10 Capital, have been raising 100+ million euro funds. That's all excellent to see. But then when you examine IPO stage, you still unfortunately see that that we're also seeing European companies not creating as much value from the investment. So, for example, there was a recent report from Deal Room, I think it was last year, that showed that at the IPO stage, so years after IPO, it varies, but at the IPO stage, you see 13 and a half times more value output from US companies than from European companies. So there's something that explains the value creation gap also, and that's something that I think we should think hard about.
And so if we try to analyze this a little bit, and also what you see, how European companies go to market versus also US companies go to market, because you've really seen it from both sides. And also because we're talking about the funding gap. Okay, we all know that it's there, and we know it's going to stay like this for some time. And I mean, things are changing in the right direction, and that is good. But still, we have to work with what we have now, right? When we talk about creating startups and making European champions in the next 5 years, we have to find maybe also other possibilities to grow quicker. And we were talking about this also last time, because when we see also from our community companies raising funds in Europe, and they say, okay, we can raise 10 million in a Series A maybe in Europe, and we would go with the same business to the US, it would be 10 times more. So we don't play with we don't have the same cards in our hands, let's say. So what do you see maybe differently between what US vendors, software providers, SaaS companies are doing in the cybersecurity space versus Europe? What do you think we should, we talk about, taking risk is so complicated in Europe, and but this also applies to the startups, right? So what do you think we can do, or what you maybe also do with Eclectic IQ to basically break the game and to be at the same speed, or to try to get to the same speed to be able to compete in a global market, because we are in a global market, and so we just have to get to the same level.
Yeah. Well, we are for sure in a global market, or at least in cybersecurity, most of a global market. I think China, Iran, and some others are a little bit closed off for us. But I think that there are really three areas that I see that are very, very different, right? And obviously, there's the growth capital gap and value creation gap, which is, I think, linked to the other areas. Number two is labor law. As alluded to earlier about being a guest here, I think that I'm not going to say that the strong employee protections that we see in Europe are a bad thing or a good thing. But I think that you can say that even though they provide great stability for employees, they make the business environment very, very difficult, right? So what that means is that versus US companies, European companies trying to grow are hesitant to hire the right talent and have a very, very difficult time letting go of the wrong talent. And what's most challenging about that is not just the process, it's also the expense. So, for example, you just saw today Meta was able to announce, or maybe earlier this week, that they are issuing a layoff because of new strategic goals, right? Well, if you shrink that down to a scale up, you can do the same thing in the US. Here, you cannot, because that'll be hundreds of thousands of euros, which will just really, really hurt your cash flow for a European scale up. So labor law is probably one of the biggest challenges. And I think there are some interesting solutions to that, which we can discuss maybe in a moment. The third issue is national security pipeline. So the US and the UK have for various reasons that we all know, a very strong tradition of military service, very broad global presence in the national security space. And so something like, it depends on who you ask, but something like 45 to 50% of US cybersecurity professionals have some sort of national security background, myself obviously included. And so that means we enter the private sector with a really robust skill set, either on the high level strategically, where we've really learned to do a lot of planning that really translates well to the business world, or on the far more tactical technical level, where you have operators at the National Security Agency who can easily translate right into cybersecurity very effectively, very, very fast, right? So there's a huge talent pool that continental Europe doesn't really have the same access to. And furthermore, it's really hard to hire out of that talent pool for a European company, even remotely, say, hire US personnel, because they have dramatically different salary expectations. So I think those are the three most serious challenges: growth capital / value creation, labor law, and access to talent.
So if we take them maybe one by one, shall we? That could be interesting. About the value creation. So we talked about the growth capital. So we know that this is an issue, even though also what was interesting at the panel that you have been to, at the panel that was earlier the day, we also had the feedback from the venture capital side that said there is a lot of capital available for companies, but also companies have to be, up for the challenge and really present, scalable business models, good running companies, good sales organizations. And it's also something that is in the responsibility of the companies and of the startups to build companies that are really worth investing in. So that was, I think, an interesting comment also. So if we talk about the value creation, how would you tackle that issue for the European market? What are maybe the two major points that we can think about when we talk about the value creation gap?
I think that's really, really tough, right? So I think that Europe has great ideas. It has great people. In fact, some of the greatest ideas of the last 20 years are European. They just moved to the US, right? So if you walk around Silicon Valley, you look at what's happening with AI, so many founders, so many stars are actually European immigrants, right? So it's definitely in the water here, right? I think that in terms of capitalizing on it, if we do address growth capital, then we need to also think about how we view the world, right? So I think that there's a prevalent European tendency to think regionally, to think more tactically, more technically, and in my own space, cyber threat intelligence, in our customer base, we see highly, highly technical users versus the US. We see that, but we also see users who are thinking in terms of the business. They're thinking high level strategically. So, for example, a cyber threat analyst in the US might be thinking about what are the assets that I'm trying to protect in my organization? What are the business's strategic goals, and how can I mitigate risk using cyber threat intelligence? Versus in Europe, there's certainly some of that, especially in the financials and other large organizations, but it's more common to see thinking more along the lines of how do I detect technical attacks and mitigate those. And so the way I relate this back is that that's a very near brain style of thinking, right? So it's very technical, very tactical, and it's not really seeing the origin point of who and why might be trying to attack me. And I think you see that in the business world too. So what that means is that if you zoom out as a European business in cybersecurity, but in other sectors too, and you look at where's the world's largest market, the US, right? Maybe start there and first try to solve for those problems, and then actually try to solve for the European problems so that you can grow, right? So I think I can already kind of hear some of the audience thinking, well, how do we hire the right salespeople in the US? How do we then scale in the US when that's so expensive, so challenging? And then why don't we just start over there, start in Delaware, and then we're not European? Well, I think actually what you should be doing is just thinking about the US problems, because they are usually simplified versions of what you're trying to solve yourself here when you're selling to a European prospect base too. I think you don't necessarily have to move to the US, but you should think in the US mindset first, and then look at the rest of your global prospect base.
I think that's an interesting point of view because, as you know, what we try to do also at the European Champions Alliance is to keep the companies as long as possible in Europe to make them real European champions. But what underlines what you just said is basically the question of mindset that we have discussed so over and over and over again. To say, have an open mindset, also go to the different countries that are important for you, to the US, go to conferences, discuss with thought leaders, try to interact with clients, potential partners, to really open up your mind on where you need to go strategically and not so much be concentrated on your home market for 2-3 years and then basically discover the world once you try to, internationalize because you have raised some funds to do that, but really to have that growth mindset from the very beginning. And also the mindset of, creating as you said, the value creation gap, to create a company that is really creating the value that you need at the end. And I think if I just rephrase what you said, is we are thinking too much about the technical problem and about the technical solution and the technical solution for the problem in a very engineer-minded way. And what we would need much more, and this is something that we can do, I would say, quite easily, is to always add to that the business aspect and how am I gonna sell the technical solution that I have right now to solve a business problem? Because in the end, it's always a business problem.
That's exactly right. And I can actually relate some of our story there to really drive that home. So, for example, our product is extremely well liked by our what I call extreme tail super fans, right? And we love those fans. So these are our users who are highly, highly technical. They probably run Linux at home. They like to set up their own configurations. They might have specially complicated smart home setups. I do things like that. And that's fantastic. And we support them and we want more of them and we welcome them. But in the US, we find fewer of them. They're out there, but we find much more of a focus on optimizing cost per FTE. And we're seeing that more and more, especially in this environment and after the zero interest rate phenomenon is over and with vendor consolidation and so on and so forth. And so what we're thinking is, okay, let's still support our super fans, of course, But let's also think about that overall business problem that the US prospects want to solve, which is ultimately mitigating business risk. And if we can simplify their lives, we can actually probably simplify our European customers' lives much the same way, because ultimately, when you really go underneath those layers, they're still looking for the same thing, right? And so I think that when you think about it this way, you need to work smarter. And I would love to say work smarter, not harder, but actually you have to work smarter and harder. That doesn't necessarily mean more hours, but when you are resource limited, you need to think harder, you need to think globally, and you need to work smarter. Wherein the work smarter aspect is trying to optimize the relatively limited resource that you have. And the harder aspect is grinding it out, building the products, and shipping them. So you're kind of adopting a bit of the US mentality, but kind of adding a European flavor of more technical skill to that building aspect of it.
I think this is something that we need to dive a little bit deeper into in the next couple of months when we talk about this value creation that is so important, and that we maybe need to, let's say, emphasize a little bit more also for the European companies. I think that would be interesting. But I would like to, because we can talk about the value creation for the next couple of days, right? I wanted to go to the next point that you mentioned, and that we already covered a little bit in the podcast episode with Oliver Cost, that people can maybe refer to. I think it was number 4 or 5, about the question of labor law. Of course, this is something where, you have all of the alert systems of everyone going on when we talk about labor law in Europe. That is true. And we talked with Oliver also about the cost of innovation in Europe, and that, of course, the fact that you cannot do hire and fire in Europe. And we are all thankful for that, of course, can also be innovation, let's say, keep innovation down, because you don't have the same flexibility that you have in Europe than you have in the US. So what do you think, because you said we could talk about a couple of solutions, what do you think could be solutions that we could employ without changing let's say, the security standard we have in Europe?
Yeah, the fundamental fabric of European culture. So I'll get to that in a moment. I just want to fact check something I said earlier, or actually clarify about value creation, which, as you said, we could go on forever. So I'll make it fast. But to my point about U.S. companies generating 13 and a half times higher value per capita, what I mean by that is that in the U.S., according to Deal Room, new companies generated $44,000 US per capita between the year 2000 and the year 2023, versus 3,300 USD in Europe. So that's a 13 and a half times higher value creation figure, versus US companies had access to only 7.5 times more growth capital. So that's a little bit complicated, but the bottom line is that it should be 13 and it should be more proportional, right? So you're still seeing the value creation gap much higher than the growth capital gap. So I thought that was very, very interesting. For labor law solutions, I think that, so first, I did hear Oliver's podcast. Maybe it's Olivier. I'm not sure if I get the name right.
I think it's Oliver for the English speaking and Olivier for the French speaking.
Okay. Yeah. Well, my wife is French, but I haven't yet learned, unfortunately. But so I actually think that he's really onto something when he mentioned that there could be a special category for either startups or tech people where labor law or labor protections are weaker, because salaries are much higher, right? And your value as an employee tends to be much higher. So the incentive to accept such a role where there's maybe less job security is in higher salaries, is in a greater reward, greater challenge, and your own marketability. I think that and we've seen analogies to this in the US government, where we had a very hard time finding cybersecurity talent in the US federal government, when the private sector would pay much, much more, right? So we actually created a special category of cyber-focused job codes in the US federal government that actually had a higher salary. So if the US government with 330 million people can manage that, then I think various European countries can, but the challenge is that I think it has to be member state by member state, because as far as I know, there is no EU-wide labor law standardization. Maybe there's something to that effect, but I think ultimately with the EU being a political and trade alliance and not a federal union, most of these changes still have to be member state by member state.
So I think that indeed it's something that we can continue discussing. And as I said, I'm happy to make the introduction to Olivier. So maybe you can discuss it, the two of you, your vision on that, because he's now living in the US. And so I think there are a lot of things that you can talk about together. So I think that's interesting to put that idea on the table somewhere and maybe start discussing it and how it could be something that could solve a problem for us, but not be too optimistic about changing labor laws in the near future. But well, it's still something that you can discuss and that can be could be part of the solution. Now, when we talk about the national security pipeline, and we said that there's a lack of people that can integrate companies like yours, and it's really hard to find talent. We know that the war of talents is really, really hard in Europe. So, and we even had the idea of having I think it was a European university for cybersecurity professionals. That was an idea that came up during the panel. How do you see, what do you think could be some ideas or solutions for that in Europe to have more qualified people?
Yeah. So first, I think that's a very thoughtful notion. In the US, if you look at LinkedIn for many senior cybersecurity people, executives in really private sector or public sector, in addition to a national security background, you'll often see Naval Postgraduate School, or you'll see another national level school for either leadership, security, foreign policy, something like that, even in cyber, right? Because often this is actually a very geopolitically driven space. In Europe, you don't see that. You see French schools, which are excellent. You see, some German schools, some Dutch schools, and I'm obviously referring to the EU, so not the UK. I think that it would be interesting to have an EU-wide school, but then you get really back to the root challenge as an American looking outside in. In the US, we refer to the US as an experiment. And I referred to the EU as an experiment to someone when I was pretty new here, and they said, "Oh, that's really interesting. I've never heard that before." But I think it is an experiment in a way, and it is ultimately, though, a political and economic trade alliance. And so I don't want to get into what I think about the idea of further federalization or not, simply because I don't really have the answer that I think is really indisputably the right answer. But I do think that since it's not a federal union, it's very hard to create these sort of EU-wide schools. But even if that's solved, which I think you could probably do if you could figure out who's going to host it, who's going to give the resources to it, that's not, too hard. It also illustrates the absence of a true single unified capital market, right? So the Draghi report and everyone else has been referring to the absence of a European NASDAQ. And I think that unless you adopt some of these traits of a federal union, which I know are extremely controversial, then it's going to be hard to really get there. So I think one thing that we discussed was this notion of a private sector union. Some time ago, obviously, we all know Airbus, and in the 70s, Airbus was really created as the answer to Boeing. So no Boeing, no Airbus, right? And now in cybersecurity, we're seeing a lot of consolidation where eventually someone like Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, or maybe someone like CrowdStrike, who knows, will be kind of the Boeing of cybersecurity. So there could be room for a consortium of a sort of Cybus, right? And I'm not going to pretend I thought of this. This is what several other others have been kind of whispering around. But I think that might be a roundabout way to really overcome the challenges of the EU itself as a government infrastructure, not being a federal union. And you'll also find I have a bit of a theme here where, and maybe this is the US in me, but I actually don't think that government is necessarily always the swiftest way to solve these challenges.
So yes, so it is something that we have discussed in the past, and it's also something and a thesis that we defend at the European Champions Alliance, that we say, there's a lot of things that we can expect from the public sectors, from politics, and from people who are taking care of those kind of questions. But in the same time, and this is what we try to do at the ECA, is to say, how can the private sector basically get closer together on those kind of questions and find solutions that maybe do not require so much, political involvement around those kind of things. And I remember it was funny on the conference in Amsterdam. I don't know if you've mentioned, but someone brought up the idea of the European Cybersecurity University. And I think the first two comments were, yes, but, where I think that maybe it would have been a little bit, when we go back to the question of risk and taking a risk and, being bold in bold ideas, something that we can inspire, I think, from the US is where people would say, yes, and let's make it real big. And basically, have a couple of companies who would have the means in Europe to invest in those kind of initiatives and to basically just put it on the table. And I remember in the very beginning when we started the European Champions Alliance, I was discussing with one of my contacts in Germany, and I said, it's really hard to raise this kind of initiative, to create an association, and you try people to become members, and it's so hard to raise a little bit of funding so that we can really do what we want to do. And he said, what would be the US way of doing those things? And I said, no, please tell me. And he said, you would have maybe 10 or 15 companies, everyone puts $1 million in the middle, and then we just raise an initiative and we try to create real impact. And what is the difference in Europe is that, we're trying to convince companies to become members of the European Champions Alliance, and it's really, really hard because they're waiting for some return on investment, or they're waiting for us to generate leads and those kind of things for them. But basically what we just try to do is have those discussions and create those bold ideas together and bring people together. So this is why it was interesting and it really kind of poked me when we had this idea of the European Cybersecurity University. I said, okay, why not? Why not think about it?
Yeah, I think that your slogan, I think you may have actually coined a slogan. Instead of saying yes, but, say yes, and, right? Yes. And. And so what that means is, yes, we should think about this. And here are the things that we need to think about that maybe pitfalls, maybe are things that we need to solutionize regarding. So I actually see the European University as an easier challenge to overcome, just because I don't think it would be, relatively speaking, as expensive. I think the challenge, maybe I'm wrong there, but some of the challenges that I foresee with this sort of a consortium are bureaucratic challenges, right? So I think you see from the very start, and you see it with the Draghi report too, where, like you said, the first instinct is yes, but who is going to offer up this money? And you saw, I'm not going to say all of Germany, but you saw at least one German minister say, no way, forget it. This is not even worth discussing. We're not going to do it. This is 800 billion euros. We're done. And it's already over, right? So we have to find a way to overcome that. But then it's also, how did Airbus, for example, overcome the bureaucratic challenges of having a consortium with France, Germany, Spain, the UK? And how have they had so much relative success versus Boeing, right? The last couple of years. I haven't checked their stock prices lately, but I think we've seen that they seem to be doing well. So I think those are some lessons that we would need, because otherwise there is one challenge that I've seen many times coming from the defense sector, which is, when there is a problem, there's always somebody with a bright idea to create what we call a center of excellence, which we used to say is a silo of excellence, right? So there's a problem with information warfare, adversaries using information warfare. Okay, let's create the countering information warfare unit. It's going to be in the US like $3 billion, but here it could be 30 million euros, and then nothing really happens, right? If somebody gets a promotion, somebody gets a fancy job title, and nothing really happens. I think that's something to avoid. And when you're thinking of something like a Cybus or a consortium, need to think early on, how do you make sure this thing is agile? How do you make sure that you integrate the various national cultures? Because they're all very different, as I've seen as the CEO of a European company. How do you make this a well-oiled machine? And this is kind of the fundamental European challenge always, right? So if Europe can solve this, then it could solve European defense, it could solve European capital, it could solve many European challenges. But obviously, this is the hardest thing to really do.
So maybe a lot of things to take away from this conversation, of course, but I think one thing that we can take away from this conversation is the question of yes and. And I know it's, when you go into management coaching, it's something that people do. It's an exercise that you do when you do workshops and those kind of things, is that you don't have the right to say yes, but you always have to say yes and. And I really like that, because basically it opens up for new ideas. And even if the ideas are not the right ones, well, you can discard them and just move on. But I think the yes and aspect and idea is really, really, really a good one. So I think we've touched upon a couple of things, the three topics that you have opened up in the beginning, which is the funding gap, the value creation gap, the national security pipeline, and also the question of talent in Europe in the cybersecurity space are really interesting, and things that we can try to work on. And this is what we're trying to do at the ECA, is to bring people together to talk about those kind of things and find solutions. So is there anything else you would like to add to this?
I just say that I think that the world is changing very, very fast, right? And I think Macron had a speech in English the other day where he said that Europe will be out of the market in 2 to 3 years if we don't see serious change. And obviously, as you said before we started recording, Draghi report said very similar things. And I think that paralysis is a very temporary solution, because eventually something breaks through it, right? That ice breaks, that ice cracks. So in Europe, I'm going to say we, even though I'm, like I said, I'm just here the last few years, but we need to really break through that. And I think as a European business, we want to be part of that at Eclectic IQ. With how much volatility we see in the US, in China, and it may not seem so, but maybe a little bit less so here, Europe has that chance to really kind of differentiate, even though it seems like the US is really pulling ahead. I think that if Europe remains as introspective as I've seen, and when I say Europe, I mean, here I'm referring to the European Union, I'm referring to what I've seen in Brussels, in various events, meeting people in Paris and Amsterdam. If that introspection can actually translate to action, there's a great opportunity, but it does have to translate to action.
Now.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's keep as a final word, maybe let's get into action now, and rather add an and than a but. So thank you very much, Cody, for those insights. I think it's really interesting to, have those two perspectives and to discuss with you between the American perspective and what we do in Europe and how things are moving forward. So looking forward to seeing how Eclectic IQ is doing in the next couple of years, and everything that we can discuss, and the Cybers and the European Cybersecurity University. So let's maybe check in again in a year or two, and to see what we have really put into action. And yeah, we're going to push those ideas forward. And thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much as well. And I will see you hopefully with some more action.
Yes. Thank you, Cody.
Thanks, Andrea.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of European Tech Talks until the end. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a 5-star rating and share it with your friends and colleagues. This will help increase our visibility on the podcast platforms. And don't forget to subscribe to receive our latest episodes. Before you go, have you considered joining the European Champions Alliance? As a member, you will have access to a network of European companies and industry experts, exclusive publications on industry-specific topics, invitations to members-only events, and support and advice on your pan-European expansion plans. If you're interested, please visit our website at european-champions.org or reach out to us on LinkedIn. See you in the next episode.